Ladies and gentlemen and fellow Kentuckians, welcome to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. I'm your host, of course, Andrew Cooperrider. Of course, Andrew Cooperrider. And I thank you guys so much for joining me for another episode. I've got some great things to tell you about, some news here for you, some good topics to talk about. We got a couple of draft bills filed for the 2023 regular session. Okay, a couple interesting bills there filed we'll talk about. And then, of course, we're going to hit upon the fact that it looks like we're going to have a special session maybe this week or next week regarding the Eastern Kentucky flood relief. Chit-chat a little bit about that. The General Assembly finally stepping up on some diversity, equity, inclusion stuff over in the Contracts Review Committee. We did a show on this a couple of weeks ago where we were talking about how that was creeping in, all the money spent, and of course that was really shared a lot online. Well, they stepped up and they've addressed the concerns to a degree. We'll talk about what they did, what it means, and then where we can keep fighting and improving upon that issue. And then finally, the red wave we're looking at in November is how big is it going to be? There's some doubts it's going to be as big as we think it is. Some conversation about, are the Republican candidates too weak? I'll give you some hot takes on that. But before we dive into it, please like, comment, and share. If you're watching on Facebook, give it a like. Put a comment on it. That helps the platform. It helps the way they spread it. Put a comment on it. And of course, hit that share button and share it. Watching on YouTube, or if you're watching on the podcast site there, make sure you subscribe to it. And then, of course, you can always catch this in the podcast form if you don't want to sit there watching the whole video. You don't have to just watch on Facebook and YouTube. You can watch on Spotify. Listen to it on Spotify, though this episode before last, for some reason, didn't post on Spotify, so they're trying to fix that. But Spotify and Apple and all the places where you get your major podcasts, you can find this here show. And tell your friends, tell your family, tell them to go to kypodcast.com, kypodcast.com, and that's how you can share it with them. Now, finally, one more thing, please donate to the Campaign for Treasure. I'm staying on top of this stuff for you guys. Show me some love. Visit c4ky.com. That is C4, the number 4, ky.com. Hit that donate button and help out your favorite Kentuckian podcaster. I thank you guys so much, and let's go ahead and step into it. Let's first start off with Bill Wesley's bill. Bill Wesley files a draft bill for the 2023 regular session. So these are bills drafted to be considered next here in January of next year. So he files, this is draft bill request 103, and it's a birth certificates bill that says birth certificates must be marked with the biological sex at birth, male or female. You cannot mark it X or non-binary or something else. They're either male or they are female. Now, of course, he's putting this in place because what we've seen is some of the lefties out there in the world, some of the people who've decided that, biology doesn't matter anymore, and you can just be whatever gender you want to be. You know, you wake up, feel like a cat today, you can be a cat today. I'm surprised they even get a birth certificate. They say, look, birth certificates are for humans, right? They may think their kid is a snake, right? Or they may think their kid is a bunny rabbit. Or maybe they don't want to put a species on their child. When their child grows up, they want them to be able to pick their species. And in the same way as well, they don't want to mark a gender because, of course, that might be putting something on the kid that they don't feel is right. And so they want to not mark a gender so that way later on in life, the kid can make their own decision. Well, guys, I got to tell you this. You're either born woman, born female. I get it. There's some very, very small percentage of times where there's actual medical things where people are born some kind of intersex or something like that. And I think they might have to do an amendment to the bill where, honestly, they're going to have to talk about genitalia and see if the genitalia is not clear. Now, it's a sad, sad world we live in. It's a sad world we live in where Bill Wesley has to file this bill to say, look, doctors, you need to mark male or female when they're born. And it's attached to, and the bill says it's got to be based upon their biological sex, to say the least. And I think that is really, really important. It's really important that we have to file this bill, right? That we've got that issue here in Kentucky with not putting the gender on. And so Bill's saying, put the gender on. Guys, think about this. Think about this for a second. For those of you lefties who watch this because for some reason you hate yourself, I don't know. I mean, I don't know why you'd watch me. Hey, maybe I give you good information. You may hate my takes on it, but you like the news side of it. Great. But for you guys who listen to this and are sitting there saying, bigot or whatever, gender, whatever. Just think about this for a second. Think medically, okay? Whether you're male or whether you're female really, really matters medically, right? There's certain things medically that can be okay, that can be off with you if you're male versus female, right? Of course, you don't have things like, I don't know, ovarians and things like that, right? You don't have a uterus unless you're a woman. And so, those things matter medically. If you walk in saying my stomach hurts and they think you're a guy, they're going to treat that maybe differently than if you're a woman. If you talk in and say, oh, my stomach hurts, I'm nauseous, I'm getting cramps and things like that, they might ask if you're pregnant if you're a woman. But if you come in and say you're a guy, they're not going to think you're pregnant. They're going to start treating you for something else, maybe giving medicine you don't need, when it turns out at the end of the day, you may be pregnant, right? And so, which is weird. I saw a post the other day where it's like a transgender male and a transgender female, so male and female, but they both switched. We're in a relationship and having a child, and reminds me of the old meme from Rick and Morty that said, but instead of whatever they had, it says, it seems like just being straight with more steps, right? So it's a strange world we live in. But Bill Wesley filing 103 saying, hey, gender is tied to what you're born as. That's got to be on your birth certificate. No non-binary, no X is there. So that's an interesting bill that has been filed by Bill Wesley. Once again, that's draft bill request 103. And then we also have Democrat Rachel Roberts filing bill request 179. That's a female hygiene products, a sales tax exemption. So that is to get, of course, tampons, pads, things like that, to be exempted from sales tax. When I saw this bill, I went and searched to see if toilet paper was exempted, because I said, if toilet paper is exempted, female hygiene products should also be exempted. Now, in this case, I looked it up, and it appears that in Kentucky, toilet paper is sales tax exempt. So that being stated, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to say that, saying female hygiene products untaxed, that's a fine thing for me. Of course, I'm always about cutting as many taxes as we can everywhere we can. And hey, female hygiene products, a lot of things that are made and normally marked as a necessity certainly fall into that category. Let's see here. So that is draft bill request 179 by Democrat Rachel Roberts. Female hygiene products, tax exempt. And that certainly, I think, is a good bill as far as that goes. Now, what we're also looking at going into this next week or so is a special session they're looking at to address the Western Kentucky situation. Now, there's some conversation going on about what is the role of government here. Now, one thing that makes me uncomfortable when I read what the Herald Leader or some of these other liberal newspapers are saying about it, they're talking about how, well, the General Assembly can afford to be generous, right? So they can afford to be generous because they have $2 billion in surplus from the budget. They got $2 billion in their rainy day account, in their savings account. And because of that, they can afford to be generous. Now, first off, I don't like the way they can afford to be generous. Those are our tax dollars. It should be, we can afford to be generous with our money, if we're going to say that at all. But I don't even like that word. We can afford to be generous. You took that money from us at gunpoint, pretty much. Maybe I couldn't. Maybe you're going through something financially and you can't afford. You can barely afford to put food on your table, and they're taking tax dollars from you and saying, well, you can afford to give to others. Maybe you can't. And so using that term, they can afford to be generous as a state, as if this isn't money that was taken from people. Let's keep that in mind. Makes me unnerved. Now, I'm not saying it shouldn't be addressed. I'm not saying we shouldn't help out at Eastern Kentucky. What I'm saying is it makes it uncomfortable. Here's the other thing that makes me uncomfortable here. Anytime we start talking about government doing charity work, government is horrible at charity work. I'll give you a perfect example. Let's take the SNAP benefits program. So a lot of people would agree SNAP's not of the welfare programs, not SNAP. Food stamps isn't the worst one because it is, of course, tied to it's tied to an exact amount. It's not straight cash, right? You're controlled on what you can or can't buy with it. And then you get your, of course, your food stamps, and you can go and buy food stamps. And you can go down with your food stamps, buy whatever you want. Most people would agree that's not a bad thing. But here's something to bring up. Here's something to note, right? The most the administrative costs on the food stamp program, on the SNAP program, federally is right around about 18%. So if they're spending $100, $18 of it goes to administering, and then $82 of it actually ends up benefiting the people who need the food. Now, what gets interesting is when you look at private charity, on the other hand, such as a food bank, some of the largest food banks in the world and in the country, food banks operate with an administrative cost of sometimes less than 1% most often. Some of the largest food banks are operating with a 0.5, 0.8%, because part of it is they don't have to pay staff. They have a lot of volunteers. The government, it isn't good. They can't really bring in volunteers like that. They in turn have to go ahead and pay people. So of course they're limited on what they can do. So that leans into the administrative costs, but then also too, as well, it's difficult to coordinate volunteers, bring in volunteers. It's easier just to pay them if you view it as not your money anyways, or not as coming from the taxpayer. You may go ahead and say it. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do the work. I'm just saying first we have to recognize that government doing charity work is innately expensive. It costs more for government to do charity work than these private charities. The same money in the hands of private charities, if we were able to, instead of being forced taxed by the government, could give the money to the private charities could actually spend it a lot better in these situations. That's also why it makes me so uncomfortable when we see these disaster relief charities set up that people can give money to that's run by the government, because you've got Bashir did it for Western and Eastern Kentucky now, where they have this disaster relief thing where you can donate money to it. But here's the thing, right? Going into it, once again, I guarantee you give that same money to a private nonprofit charity, right? The administrative costs on it won't be the same. And then also you've got the cost that goes into accountability and that goes into the transparency of it, because anytime government does something, if government is taking in money for a specific project and it's going to act in charity donation and you give money to it and it gets handed back out, we are going to want to audit what happened with that money. And that in turn is going to cause more expenses on the taxpayer as well, compared to if you just give that same money to a private nonprofit. Most people never even ask the question of what's going on there. We innately trust it. We can look at their financials, of course, too, as well. And that gives us some idea as individuals, but they have a quote unquote profit incentive. They don't make a profit, but an incentive to stay in business, to continue helping people. If they want to continue doing their work, they have to be good stewards of the money. So, most of the time nonprofits are pretty one, they spend it better. More of it reaches the person. And then on top of that, it costs us less to administer when we're using private nonprofits. So generally they can get it done right. Unless of course it's the Clinton Foundation, in which case, I'd rather light my money on fire than give it to the Clinton Foundation, but that's just me. Anyway, so what gets interesting is that terminology we're using of saying, well, they can afford to be generous. I hate that, but they're going to do the special session. Now the question is this special session going to just address Eastern Kentucky, and what parts is it going to address? Are we talking about providing infrastructure, rebuilding the infrastructure, the state-owned and local-owned infrastructure that was wiped out, maybe providing funds of that? Okay. We're talking about giving straight cash to people. We're talking about giving loans to people to help them rebuild houses. This is an interesting situation because you had flooding not in floodplains, and as I understand it, if you're not in the floodplain, you can't get flood insurance. So it is a big issue out there. I'm not saying we shouldn't maybe do something for them. Like I said, I wish we could do it through private nonprofits. More money reaches them and it's a lot better, but I understand government takes so much already. And so maybe there's not as much money out there and government stepping in here. Maybe it's one of the times government can do something. Like I said, debatable, but let's say they do go ahead and be generous, using the Herald Leader's words, which I, once again, hate it. If they do go ahead and say, I'm going to be generous and giving out those funds, then we go ahead and say, okay, what are we looking at with this special session? What's it going to do? And the way special sessions work is they hammer out a deal beforehand, and then it gets passed in a day or two, and then they're back out of session. It leaves very little time for citizen input. I don't like that at all. They're hashing a deal out without citizens even getting to look at it or having input on it. I think that's wrong. I do think that's wrong. I think we should get to have input on it. They move it quick, and then who knows what else they're tacking on. Remember the last special session about this time last year was to deal with the state of emergency over the road and to renew that state of emergency, continue on these lockdowns and mandate policies and address some funding. But while they were doing things regarding schools and funding for hospitals because they're short staffed, because they were firing people because they didn't get the thing, while that was going on, they also at that point, and as I covered in my prior podcast, decided to give $410 million of taxpayer funds to Ford. So we could see another deal like that coming in here, especially if Bashir's been hopping one up and looking to give out more of your funds to other people. So we'll be watching that special session carefully, watch those bills carefully, see what they'll be doing. We'll cover more on that probably next week. I think they'll have it between this podcast and next podcast based upon the conversations I'm having with legislators, but we'll see what happens there. Now, a few weeks ago, I talked about the Contracts Review Committee and how they just kind of let pass on through a lot of contracts regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. I made actually some Facebook posts about it. I made, of course, this podcast about it. And since then, it appears they have listened. They have stepped up to the plate. And what we see is the Department of Education putting forward some DEI contracts and them getting knocked down, going as far as to say, now what happens when the Contracts Review Committee says no? We'll get to that here in a second. But they're stepping up and saying the Damien Sweeney, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Belonging for the State Board of Education, something that probably shouldn't exist anyways. But anyways, he was apparently, his benefits package was a sweet $130K a year, $130,966. The Contracts Review Committee voted that contract down because we don't need a Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and belonging, because that sounds communistic, of course. When worried about equal, we need worrying more about outcomes and opportunities as government is wrong. And we've covered this in prior podcasts. Government needs to worry. Government creating equal outcomes guarantees people being shrunk down. And of course, this whole diversity, equity, inclusion is just code words for those CRT thoughts that really are Marxist ideas that definitely lead to the destruction of, I believe, our American way of life, of equal opportunity and each person being in charge of their own destiny. But more importantly, not telling children that you're innately disadvantaged or advantaged because of the color of your skin, because that's wrong. That's wrong. We've talked about this. We said we've even talked about what is a better parameter, because it's not color of skin, but it's more regional is a much better thing of looking at whether people are advantaged or disadvantaged. But even then, if I was listening to Jim Jordan's actually talking about this the other day, where he was talking about how, as long as, and I, this was something that I read from one of my favorite people, Zig Ziglar, always talked about, as long as you allow yourself to be a victim of your current situation, you'll never rise above it. To say it another way, Zig Ziglar used to say this. He used to say, take where you are right now. Do you believe there's something you can do over the next 2 weeks to make your life worse? Lie, cheat, steal, yell at somebody, do something bad, right? Now, can you also say that there's something that you can do over the next 2 weeks that would make your life better? Maybe you start working out, maybe you eat better, maybe you spend more time with family, do some things you've been meaning to do, but there's something, get more sleep, maybe there's something you can do to make your life better. If you answer yes about those questions, and everybody should, because of course it's the case, then what you've stated is your life can be better or worse, and the decision is entirely up to you. And that is the American dream, that you can control your own destiny. And DEI and belonging and all this other Marxist BS that they're trying to pump into these kids doing the work of the CCP is really just that. And we need to be standing up to it. And so they knocked down this contract. They also knocked down in Northern Kentucky diversity, equity, and inclusion training for $54,000. And then also a contract to create 6 modules out at Ashland for $309,540. Now, what happens here? What happens if they knock these contracts down? Well, of course, then they go to the cabinet for finance secretary, and he can override the basically he's overriding the veto the contract review committee did. But with that being done, when the next time they're in regular session, when they're setting their own agenda, because during special session, the governor sets the agenda. So they can't address this during that. They can go ahead and vote in and say any contracts disallowed by the contracts review committee is hereby terminated, and you cannot bring a contract back like it. And so what they're doing is they're setting up this list, and so they may be able to overcome it. But if we push on our legislators come to special session, we tell them to follow up on what the statutory committee on contracts has done to go ahead and knock down these diversity, equity, and inclusion things, we can start to see an improvement and start to push back on this. But then we got to watch out, because they'll come up with a new term. Because when we caught them on CRT, they moved to this DEI, and I think they're starting to move from DEI to this SEL, this social and emotional learning side of things. And they're going to keep trying to move. We got to stay on top of it. We got to stay in the spirit and all that. We got to do it. Now, though, we need our General Assembly to follow through. We need our General Assembly, when they get into office, to say, we're not going to allow these contracts. We need our General Assembly to step up and really grow back. And we see Bill Wesley's got 103 that he files. And now we see the Contract Review Committee stepping up. And so they got to take a stand and follow through, make some gutsy moves. How you make a gutsy move to say, you know what, we were wrong to create the Commission on Equal Opportunity and Race, Commission on Race, here in Kentucky. We are wrong to do that. We're going to take that committee down. We're going to remove it, which, by the way, when the citizen members of that committee is a lobbyist, but putting that to the side, I don't know why lobbyists can sit on committees, but we should probably deal with that situation. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to disband that committee. We're going to get rid of it, because that is just endorsing these Marxist ideas. We're going to step up to the plate. We're going to come back, and we're going to make sure we're coming back, and this whole diversity, equity, inclusion, all this BS, we're getting rid of it. We're stepping up to the plate. We're standing strong, and please, General Assembly, follow through. So the Contract Review Committee did their first step. They moved from just green light and all this stuff to at least making a substantive stance against it, and we should say thank you. We should say thank you. You'll see a Facebook post about this probably even before this podcast goes out. I'll probably post about this on Monday. The podcast goes out on Tuesdays, but I'll make the post on, obviously I recorded before Tuesday, but I'll make the post on Monday. So go back and please go ahead and share that. So they got to step up and stand and say enough is enough. We've seen a victory for what's right. We need to continue to stand in support of it. And also, if our legislators are doing good things, we need to go ahead and give them those kudos. So Contract Reviews Committee, kudos for listening to how upset the people were, the diversity, equity, and inclusion contracts, and stepping up and knocking them down. One more thing I want to talk about. We're seeing worries about this federal red wave, this possible, we believe there's going to be a red wave. We believe the Republicans are going to win because of how terrible the economy is, how awful Biden is, and everything else. But there's starting to be indications that may not be the case. And so it leaves the question of what is happening. Now, a lot of people want to say it's because we have bad candidates. These Trumpian, basically they're trying to spin the story that I believe the establishment Republicans are trying to spin a story saying that these Trumpian candidates are not good candidates and they can't win. And if we keep listening to Trump, we're going to keep losing. Right. I think that's what they're trying to say, which is interesting because Trump is more popular than ever now, especially after that FBI raid. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense for them to claim that. So what is it? What do I think it is? Actually, I don't think it's the fact that these Trumpian candidates or anything else. I think it is the Republican voter is slightly demotivated. And you'd say, why? They hate Biden, they hate everybody else. Why are they demotivated? And I say it's because of some of the actions that we have seen the Senate doing here recently. They seem to have flopped on this. They were not supposed to pass this basically as Green New Deal and this reconciliation package and everything else. And McConnell and company up there in the Senate were supposed to, they're cutting deals on it and everything else to stop it from happening. And it happened. So they give them gun control. They give them some other bipartisan stuff. Right. And what do we see here? So it demotivates the Republican voter, because if you think to yourself, well, what are they even going to do? because we just saw them pass red flag gun laws. So what are they even going to do? Right. And if that's what you're thinking, which I'm sure a lot of Republican voters are, I know I'm thinking it. I'm like, golly, you guys just passed red flag gun laws. That's certainly demotivating to a lot of Republicans. And so I think they've overestimated. They've said, well, people really, really hate the Democrats, so they'll vote for Republican no matter what. Not realizing that, no, they won't vote for Republican no matter what. You got to show that it's not enough to just say, we're going to stop the Democrats. You need to show us how, tell us how, and have your actions shine through, saying it's not enough to stop the. See, I think a lot of these Republican legislators and at the federal level believe we're in a high school debate. This is a nice prim high school debate, and that's not what we're at. Look at what the Democrats are doing. They have drug us into a bar fight. We are in a bar fight, and we got to start standing up and fighting like that. We've got to step up to the plate and say enough is enough. And we're not going to let these things pass. But instead, we see people like McConnell and a bunch of other Republicans, at least 10 others, coming through and voting yes on red flag gun legislation because they believe. Now, their thought process there was, well, people are really dissatisfied with the economy and this whole gender stuff going on with the Democrats. And they are. That is pushing a lot of people away. I met somebody today, lifelong Democrat, changed because of all the gender stuff going on. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes them worried about their kids. And so people are saying, look, we're worried about all those things that we talked about. And so because of that, they're definitely not going to vote for a Democrat. But maybe we can attract over some more Democrats if we soften our stance on gun control. I believe that was the thought process of people like Mitch McConnell that voted yes on that, is they said, look, I'm in a purpley state. So one, if I'm easy on this vote, I can go ahead and help me secure my state, show that I can be bipartisan, reasonable, blah, 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 blah. And then also we can help attract over some Democrats that are on the edge that see Republicans. Maybe they can be a little bit more reasonable on issue like gun control. That's their mind. I'm not saying they are. I'm saying they're unreasonable on issue of gun control. We should convince them that our position is the best, not change it to fit them. But that's besides the point. And so they pass that to think, okay, we're going to bring over these voters. And then they think, well, these people, they're not going to vote for a Democrat. So they're going to have to vote for a Republican. So it doesn't matter. People who care about gun control, right? Second Amendment. And that's a big thing. I mean, anytime you see Republicans campaigning, especially in primaries, they say, I'm pro-gun and I'm pro-life. If you're not pro-gun and you're not pro-life, you don't have a shot as winning as a Republican. So I think a lot of them adapt that without even really meaning it, as obvious based upon that red flag vote. But why do they adopt that? Why do they have to say that? You have to say that because of the fact that it's such an important issue to Republicans. It's an incredibly important issue to them. And so when you're weak on it, it demotivates them. And now they don't want to show up to the polls. That's what I think it is. I think you've demotivated possible voters. I think that's part of it. The other thing is that they're playing a game. Anytime you see polling too, it's going to be hard to judge because you're going to want to, when you're doing a poll and you're trying to poll probable voters, what they look at is in the biz, something called, we look at historical voter turnout. And so to distill down a list, you're going to look at people that show up maybe to 3 out of the last 4 elections. And that's who you're going to call. So that way you're getting a pretty good list of probable voters. But that doesn't capture individuals. And I'm sure there's a lot of you probably listening to this podcast that haven't voted in 3 out of the last 4 elections. If you think about it, you've maybe voted in 2. Maybe you've only voted in the presidential elections. You don't normally vote in midterms. Or you've only voted in, like I said, 2 out of the last 4. Maybe the last president and last midterm. You don't vote in the off-year elections, right? And so those voters like that, or maybe they're newly fired up, they're going to break red. And I think they're not exactly accounting for that as well. I mean, we won't know till election day, but it's worth stating. And then also appears there might be some money woes going on with the Senate Republican caucus. They're at the federal level. They're yanking some spending in some places, some $10 million in ad spending. Now they say they're just moving it around. But if their donations are down, what's that say? Why are they down? Are they down because you've turned off the NRA and all these other people that feel so strongly about guns because they think, why donate to you if you're just going to vote like a Democrat anyways? And I know, and I hear those Republicans out there that say, well, they're still not as bad as a Democrat. Democrat would be much worse. If you had nothing but Democrats, it'd be awful. And I'm not saying that's not true. I'm just saying, how do you sell that to somebody to turn out? They already think their vote barely matters because, it appears that it's corrupt systems and the such that whoever got the most money matters, or maybe there are individuals that believe, hey, we haven't done enough to secure our elections to make sure they're fair. So they already maybe don't want to turn out because they don't think it matters. And then on top of that, you're going to say, look, we're going to behave in such a way, we're going to behave in a way that demotivates you. I think that's a bad calculation. I think they calculated bad. They've taken for granted people way too much because of how bad Joe Biden is. And that might be causing people to not turn out quite as much. That could be possibly what they're seeing. I don't know, but that's something. That's my take on that. So there you go. We covered a couple of things today. Covered a couple of great news. Please share this podcast with others. Get the word out there. Spread the word. Tell people about it. Once again, visit C4KY.com. That's C4KY.com to go ahead and make those donations. Of course, like, comment, share, tell people about the podcast. This is the news you're not getting anywhere else. They're not covering it. I have yet to see anybody else cover this. You know why? Because I will go online and research these things directly from the source, directly on LRC sites or other state sites. I'm not looking at the media to find what I talk about. So that's an important, I think that's why it's real important to go out there and share everything that you can that we're doing here. Spread the word. Stay informed. We got a few events too coming up as well. If you want to get updated about those events, text the word Liberty to 33777. Once again, text the word Liberty to 33777.